Hi there, friends. For those of you who may be interested, I'm recording this video as a record of the books that I read in 2025 with some personal review. So if you find it interesting, maybe you'll find your next good read from this list. The first book that I read in 2025 was Perelandra by C.S. Lewis. And really good read. I think the strong points here for this book are Lewis's view of anthropology. He really develops the idea of the unman, who comes out as the villain in this story. The idea of when we, as humans, give ourselves over to false ideologies, that it actually dehumanizes us. And in contrast to what true humanity is, untinctured by sin, and living for the glory of God, is the premise of this novel set on Venus. As with a lot of Lewis's books, I feel like his strong suit is anthropology, going against materialism, secular humanism. Unfortunately, his weak point is the same as it is in just about every other book that I've read, and that is perhaps an over friendliness with pagan archetypes, and he sees them as links in the story leading people to Christ, and in his view, as long as they're subservient to Christ, that they're helpful and useful ways of understanding the cosmos. I do think this is misled. The apostles were very clear that the Greco-Roman gods were to be turned away from, and that Christ was a different alternative altogether. The next book I read, also by C.S. Lewis, was The Horse and His Boy, and um, it was been a few years since I read it. I'd read this before, and it's a fun story. There's a lot of good nuggets in here about chivalry and about the correct roles of men relating to women and how they are to be leading the way with sacrifice. Um, and it talks a lot about, or illustrates, God's sovereign care over each of us, and also the concept of the fact that as believers we should be content with a humble and lowly position in God's kingdom is really shown through the warhorse Bree, who in Calormen, which illustrates the world, is a very famous warhorse. But when he goes to Narnia, he's just an average horse, and yet through that death to self, through that death to pride, he finds freedom, just freedom to be a horse in Narnia, and that's how it is for us in the kingdom of God. That Jesus says that we're not to be like the Gentiles who lord position over one another, but rather to be meek, humble, lowly in heart. The next book that I read is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and this was a really profound book. It's a good exploration of the psychology of sin, and so I think most people know that the basic premise is there's an adulterous act that's committed, and it's not committed within the book. It's prior to the book, and there's nothing lurid in the book at all, which I think is really instructive for authors, that you can wrestle with sin without having to portray it in detail that could cause stumbling for people. So there's three main characters in this book. There's the woman Hester, there's the minister, and then there's the woman's husband, Dr. Chillingworth, who discovers that this has happened unbeknownst to him, this adulterous act. He was presumed to be lost at sea, and so Hester got involved with the minister, and then later Dr. Chillingsworth turns up. Each of these individuals deal with the act in a different way. For Hester, she acknowledges her guilt but refuses to identify the man who was with her, and so she's stigmatized by the community and wears the scarlet letter, the A, for her act. And her daughter is also ostracized because of the way that she was conceived. And the minister conceals his act and is inwardly tormented by guilt, and even does a lot of self harm in order to try to atone for his guilt. And meanwhile, the doctor, who is known by Hester but not known by the minister for who he is, he finds his relief, or attempts to find his relief, through a sadistic kind of psychological torture of the minister. He becomes his personal doctor and enjoys seeing the minister tormented by his guilt and his hidden sin. So again, this is a very good illustration of how sin destroys things, a good illustration of the fact that concealed sin eats away at us, and also that people as sinners try to atone for sin either by self harm. That's a way, by masochism, or by projecting onto others, which is sadism, just pushing the guilt of everything onto another person, and wanting to punish that person. But honestly, Hester comes closest to finding true redemption in just acknowledging her sin and not trying to hide it. Unfortunately, this book doesn't, even though set in a Puritan setting, doesn't get to the heart of the gospel, which is that Christ has taken our guilt for us. And so the only way to be truly free from sin is to confess, renounce, repent, and trust in what Christ has already done. That's where we find true forgiveness and healing, and a possibility for restoration, both psychologically and relationally. The next book I read is called The Vikings, and this was a little children's book about Leif Erikson and his father Eric and their discovery of Greenland and then ultimately North America. And it was fascinating. It's a little children's book, a little history written for kids, but really informative and just a neat time period. It's also neat to see how God was using Christian Irish slaves to evangelize their Nordic masters. So just God's kingdom moves forward in mysterious ways. Thankful for the work of St. Patrick and bringing Christianity to Ireland, and then those Irish individuals who were enslaved by the Nords, sharing the gospel with their masters. Perhaps the best book that I read this year is actually an audiobook. It was called Son of Hamas, and it's an incredible true story, an autobiography, memoir, if you will, written by Masab Hasson Yousef, whose father was a founding member of the terrorist Palestinian organization Hamas. And this is Masab's true story of how he was converted to Christ. And it reads like a spy thriller. At one point, Masab was actually working for the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, which would be completely unfathomable to him at the beginning of the story. But God used him in an amazing way to save lives, to prevent mass murders, and is still using him to speak up for the truth of what's going on in that region of the world. He comes at it from a Christian perspective, so he has criticisms for Hamas as well as Israel, the Israeli state, but just in a really balanced and holistic way. So if you're trying to understand that regional conflict and how a gospel view would look in on it, I highly recommend Son of Hamas. Great read, really informative and super helpful. Next book that I read, and this one I had actually been reading for quite some time and finished it last year, is Timothy Keller's book on preaching. I know I said Son of Hamas was my favorite book of the year. This would be right up there. Possibly both of them are the best book of the year. I don't know if that's possible or not. But this book, I mean, honestly, it's worth a seminary degree if you could master this book. There's so much packed into less than 300 pages. If you are any kind of teacher or preacher of God's Word, I would highly recommend this book. Tim Keller just does an amazing job of talking about how to preach in a way that's Christocentric, culturally appropriate, how to affirm cultural narratives in the areas where they're right, and critique them in the areas where they're wrong. And I think that's such a biblical New Testament view. If you look at how Paul does it in the book of Acts, this is very powerful. It's not reductionistic. I know a lot of Christian books that you will read just are kind of fluffy. Like you read it and you're like, man, this could have been one article and it was stretched out into 200 pages. Not so with this book. This is just dynamite, beginning to end. Every page is got just nuggets and nuggets of truth in it. So, highly recommend this. This is a really good book. This is a book that's been on my shelf for quite some time. What Life Was Like When Longships Sailed. And going along with my Viking theme from earlier, it was just a really informative look at what life was like when the Vikings were ascendant. And it reminded me of the Bible verse from 1 Peter 1:18 that says that Christ ransomed us from the feudal ways inherited from our forefathers. Yeah, the life of Europe prior to Christianity was not pretty. It was ugly. It was brutal, violent, sexually violent. And reading a book like this, although tempered down to some degree, it's just helpful to realize that the whole idea of the noble savage, of the pre-Christian glory, that's not true. When Christianity came, it changed cultures, and always for the better. And I'm very thankful for that. And the next book I read, I don't have a physical copy with me, but it's called A. Lincoln by Ron C. White, and it was a biography, obviously, of Abraham Lincoln. And I'd never read just a straight-up biography of Lincoln before. Gained a lot of respect for Lincoln. He was, I believe, a truly humble politician, which is extremely rare, as we all know. A man who was very magnanimous to his enemies, who did not hold grudges, who genuinely cared about the welfare of the people, who wrestled with moral convictions, and I believe by the end of his life that he was a true believer. Definitely modeled a very meek and humble spirit and a willingness to question the cultural zeitgeist, if you will, of the age. And he wrestled for years with the question of slavery, and finally came away convinced that it was a moral wrong. And again, that's an easy thing for us to conclude. It was not easy in the middle of the 19th century to conclude that. The next book I read was called Apatheism, and I read this in preparation for an evangelism retreat that I went on this summer. And I thought it did a really good job of diagnosing the cultural moment that we're in that most of those who are perhaps put off by Christianity are not militant atheists as perhaps 10 years ago, but more so just people who are apathetic about religion in general, and maybe they were militant atheists 10 years ago, but now it's just kind of like a malaise of, well, man, if that works for you, that's fine, but I've got my hobbies, I've got my life, it doesn't appeal to me. Unfortunately, I don't think the remedy this book provided was particularly compelling. And again, this is a book that I felt could have been an article rather than an entire book. But I do applaud the effort to engage and understand our cultural moment, and I think just more discussion needs to happen along these lines. I listened to an audiobook called Unoffendable that was recommended to me by a family member, and it was a very good listen. I think the basic premise of the author that all human anger is wrong and sinful, is not 100% biblically warranted. However, I do think that we can give our anger a pass far too easily, and therefore it's a good corrective to really examine our anger and see if it's truly of God or not. Good corrective, just to not be so quickly triggered, not so quickly offended, and to walk in the way of peace. I read a book called Being Elizabeth Elliot, which is the sequel to the earlier book, Becoming Elizabeth Elliot. And it was a well-written biography. Um, it was a bit unsettling. I think everyone who reads it has found it somewhat unsettling. Um, I think is a little disappointing for some of us who really looked up to Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, just to see some of the choices that Elizabeth made later in her life. Not necessarily sinful choices, just maybe lacking some wisdom, and then sorrowful to see how ultimately the last chapter of her life was one of um, perhaps even abuse, and definitely a darker chapter in her life. The importance, I think, for me that came away from it was of no matter who you are, staying plugged into the local church and maintaining close fellowship with other brothers and sisters, not um, not isolating. So yeah, a good read, although somewhat of a sad read. The next book I read, also by C.S. Lewis, is called The Pilgrim's Regress. This is a pretty old version that I believe my grandmother got for me a few years ago from a book sale. And this book, really good. It can be underestimated because it's somewhat dense compared to some of Lewis's other writing. It can be a bit wordy and difficult to process, but I definitely think the view is worth the climb on this one. Um, this is where Lewis is best in exposing the futility of man-made philosophies, especially of materialism and secular humanism, and it's essentially an allegory on the model of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, but this is C.S. Lewis's Regress and a pathway back to Orthodox Christianity after wandering through the philosophies of the age. So yeah, very good. It'll definitely burn some brain cells on this one, but I do think it's worth it, especially if you're a lover of C.S. Lewis. I also read The Hobbit again this year. It had been probably about 20 years since I read The Hobbit. My mother read it to me, and it is, as many of you know, just a delightful story that illustrates the simple virtues of contentment and loving a life that's connected to God's creation and the simple joys of life, in contrast to those who live for greed and for materialism. And so those two archetypes are kind of epitomized in Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit, who loves the simple life of toast and jam and gardening, and the dragon Smaug, who epitomizes greed and covetousness. And the dwarf Thorin also epitomizes the ideal of greed and covetousness, and for both Smaug and Thorin, leads to their ultimate destruction. So there is a cautionary tale in here, which I think is great for us Westerners to pay attention to. Um, Similar to Lewis, I do have concerns around the use of um, certain pagan elements in Tolkien's works, and while a lot of fun and very engaging stories with great moral concepts, there is the danger, which I think we see in our culture more and more, of a kind of syncretism, of becoming more and more okay with occultic imagery and things of the past, pagan icons that, when they make their way into fiction, can start to blur the lines. And we do see more and more of an interest in new spirituality, and I just can't help but wonder if books like these and many, many others over the past probably 150 years have softened the distinction between Christendom and the previous paganism to a level that people feel that you can dabble in some of the more occult things, and as long as it's quote unquote white magic, it's okay. So definitely something we need to be on our guard in our hearts over, whenever we're reading anything that has some of that kind of imagery in it. don't think it disqualifies it from being read at all, and even read with enjoyment, but we do need to be careful and watch our hearts and watch the hearts of our children. This book was the last book that I read from 2025, Behind Enemy Lines, and it's a neat little biography of Brother Andrew, who was the Bible smuggler who moved Bibles into predominantly the Soviet countries before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and it's just really encouraging his life of faith and taking God at his word and seeing just miraculous provision from God time after time. Real encouragement to me to live for the approval of Christ and to be willing to take risks for his kingdom. So recommend that. Quick read, written for children, but very edifying for adults as well. And so that's my 2025 reading list. Maybe you'll find your next great read.